Chapter 5. Like a finely sprung coil that was triggered to snap and release, the tension in his chest eased as Tony finally breathed a sigh of relief. He had Peter safe in his arms. He had waited until the red-headed girl had closed the hinges to her apartment door before he had finally turned to the door right next to it. To think, Peter had been missing in the apartment next door this entire time. It would have been funny in its irony if Tony and May hadn't been so worried about him. Adjusting his hold on the teenage hero, Tony walked up to the Parkers' door and somehow managed to open it on his own with his arms full. He entered the apartment without any preamble, and May Parker was just as he had left her, pacing and biting her thumbnail in her acute anxiety. But that stopped as soon as she noticed Tony standing in the open doorway, with a spider-clad superhero draped over his shoulder. "Oh, thank God," May exclaimed, stepping forward immediately, as though she intended to steal Peter right out from Tony's arms and into her own. "Careful," Tony warned as he retreated back a step, the warning in his gaze combined with his words effectively cautioning May to pause. With his foot, he kicked it back against the modern-style wood slab as he closed the door behind him. May hovered fastidiously as he proceeded to walk forward toward Peter's bedroom, and noting her confusion, he went on to explain, "Apparently, he's hit his head. He might not be fully healed, yet." With a sweep of her eyes over the unconscious boy, May seemed to be looking for any visible sign of injuries. Not seeing any due to the suit covering every inch of his body, May finally conceded as she nodded in a jagged sort of manner before she hastened forward to get the door open to Peter's bedroom. The gesture was appreciated, as it made it so that Tony wouldn't have to deal with the hindrance of a doorknob again. Without the aid of his Iron Man suit, Peter's deceptively lean form was actually rather straining on his arms. The muscles that Peter had secretly packed away underneath his skin made it so that he was a lot heavier than he looked. The room was a mess. Just as Tony expected any teenage boy's room to be. But that hardly concerned him now as he sidestepped any debris, a stray Lego here, a discarded shirt there, littering the floor in order to set Peter down onto the single mattress bed. "Do you know what happened?" May asked anxiously behind him, hovering quite close over Tony's shoulder. As soon as Tony settled Peter gently onto the mattress, he proceeded to hit the spider emblem on Peter's chest, loosening the fabric of the suit so that he could strip it away. "Well, a girl had found him unconscious in an alleyway. She told me that a building exploded and that she saw Spider-Man hit his head on a metal dumpster before falling to the ground. He must have been thrown through the air by the impact of the blast." Tony slipped the loose red and blue material off of the teen's body, leaving him clad in only his boxer briefs. A quick scan of Peter's body told him that the girl had been right, that he had only a few scrapes and bruises. There had to have been a real nasty bruise on his left side, right over his ribs, but it was now a dark, yellowish color, meaning that it was almost healed. Peering downward, Tony turned the spider suit inside out and took inventory of the damage. There were a few wires that were frayed. Minimal scorch marks from the flames of the explosion. But all in all, it could have been a lot worse. It was nothing compared to what happened to Peter. Or what could have happened. Tony shivered, pushing the unpleasant thought away. Inhaling deeply, Tony finally reached down and carefully peeled away the spider mask, mindful of any potential scrapes as well as the injury on his head, revealing the blissfully unaware face of Peter Parker as he continued his slumber. Tony looked over his shoulder to May, and it was clear that she wanted to cry, but was trying to keep her emotions in check. For the sake of finding out answers. So, he hasn't woken up since? There was real fear underneath that genuine concern. She was afraid that he was in some sort of coma or that there was more of an underlying issue that they should be concerned about regarding Peter's health. He was glad that he could at least appease some of her fears now, when before, while Peter had still been missing, he had been entirely inept in that department. He always dealt better with facts, logistics, not feelings. But he now found himself caring quite deeply for this small family. What in the hell sort of spell did the Parkers cast on him, anyway? Tony shook his head, both at his wayward thoughts as well as in response to her question. "No. The girl that found him said that he was awake a little while ago and actually very talkative. Which is a good sign. Normal behavior for Peter." It was a terrible attempt at directing the conversation towards a lighter tone, and it was clear how immediate he was in his failure at the attempt when May seemed to be so wholly unaffected by it. Her brows furrowed in confusion as a frown marred her lips. "Then why didn't he come home? Or at the very least, call? He had to have known that we were worried about him." Sighing, Tony ran a tired hand down his face. This was going to be difficult for him to say. Well, the girl said that he has amnesia, May. It took a second for his words to process with her, and he could tell the exact moment that they had. May's eyes widened and she just stared at him as though he had grown two heads. When she finally moved, it was to pull out the desk chair in front of Peter's clunky, outdated computer so that she could fall into it. Bending over her lap, she rested her head in her open palms, looking thoroughly exhausted. Amnesia? Tony nodded, even though she wasn't even looking remotely in his direction. Yes. But the girl also said that memories were starting to come back to him. Tony tried his best to reassure, it's his super healing ability at work. She even said that he remembers bits and pieces of me, so it won't be too long before he regains all of his memories. What would take the average person months or even years to remember, will only take Peter up to a couple of weeks at most. May finally lifted her head, her face set fresh with a whole new series of worries. So, this girl? The one who found him, we have to worry about her knowing his secret identity, don't we? Relief swelled in his chest as he thought of yet another opportunity to sway her fears. Tony shook his head as he smiled slightly at the integrity of the red-headed girl who had saved and protected the identity of his spider-powered pupil. She said that it didn't feel right to take the mask off when Peter was so helpless. He could have been found by someone a lot worse. We're lucky he didn't. May nodded, her face finally melting with unspoken relief. I'm just glad that he's all right. Yeah, Tony agreed in a soft tone, his head turning without his permission as he looked back down at Peter, masked emotion swimming in his eyes. He'll be all right. He's strong. As he said the words aloud, it felt as though he were also convincing himself of that fact. It helped to ease that last bit of niggling worry that was stubbornly holding its grasp on his heart. Swallowing, he turned to May then and held out his hand to her. After only a moment of hesitation, she took it and he used the connection to help her to her feet and off of the swiveling computer chair. Let him rest. His mind, and body for that matter, needs it. He led her to the door with his hand guiding her while resting on the small of her back. May followed but looked back at her nephew as though she were reluctant to leave him even for a single second. Tony smiled. It was clear to anyone with eyes that May was a good aunt. But he could also see how imperative it was that she got a much-needed, heavy dose of distraction right then. Besides, you look like you could use a strong cup of coffee. May looked at him then and finally flashed him the slightest of smiles. It just barely reached her eyes. I think that I'm going to need something a lot stronger than coffee. Tony nodded. This he could work with. Closing the bedroom door behind him, he led them both to the kitchen. Irish coffee, it is. The first feelings of awareness that had reached him was the weighted sense of stifling heat. It was too hot. Almost unbearably so. Enough for it to wake him out of his deep and groggy sleep. It had to have come from the thick blanket that he felt draped over his body. The downiness of it made him think that the comforter was meant for use only in the wintertime. He wondered when it was put on him. The second thing that he was aware of was the fingers running through his hair, brushing the strands away from his forehead. It felt nice. Heavenly, actually, as the nails left behind tingling goosebumps with every stroke against his scalp. He groaned out, his eyes still closed, enjoying the comforting feeling. Mary Jane. The fingers paused, and Peter didn't even have the chance to mourn the loss of the massaging digits before a voice rang out, interrupting his half-sleep. Who's Mary Jane? His eyes snapped open wide. It wasn't a voice that he was familiar with. Only. At the same time, it was familiar. Whipping his gaze sideways, he was met with the curious brown eyes of a middle-aged woman. She had long, brown hair which was parted down the middle, and pinned up by a large hair clip. A shot of ice-cold water felt as though it was plunged into his veins. He could feel the blood drain from his face as the warm, pleasant mood he had been experiencing upon his wakefulness was replaced with full-blown panic. Shooting up from his prone position on the bed, he jumped back as he instinctively latched himself onto the wall, cornering himself protectively, just as a spider would. Who are you? He exclaimed as he bored fiery holes into the strange woman's face. Where's Mary Jane? Chest heaving, he started to hyperventilate as his erratic eyes took in his surroundings. It wasn't the room he had fallen asleep in. And Mary Jane was nowhere in sight. Whipping his accusing, yet painstakingly fearful gaze back onto the woman, he demanded in what he hoped was an authoritative voice, where even are we? The woman stared back at him, her mouth open, as though she intended to speak, but was frozen, as she couldn't find the words, and her eyes were sad. Why were they sad? "What did you do to Mary Jane?" he exclaimed, his tone getting sharper as the urgency of the situation started to settle in. "If you hurt her, I haven't hurt anyone." The woman interrupted, seeming to finally have found her voice. Her voice was seeped with consoling gentleness, though it sounded forced. "I was just in here to make sure that you were all right." This caused him to pause. And he looked at her skeptically, trying to study her to see if she were actually being truthful with him. When out of the corner of his eye, his gaze caught on skin as he noticed his arm. His bare arm. He gasped as his chin ducked downward as he looked at himself. There was nothing there except for a pair of boxer briefs. His chest was smooth and completely free of any and all fabric. What happened to his suit? No. This was a nightmare. Now this strange woman knew his secret identity. Mary Jane had warned him that he shouldn't take his suit off, but here he woke up in a strange place without it. "Where's my suit?" he asked, panicking, his chest heaving once again. Was he having a panic attack? The feeling of complete isolation and desperation flooded over him as he struggled through every gasping breath that he inhaled. His thoughts were speeding by a mile a minute, wondering bleakly at what would become of him now. Mary Jane had said that it was dangerous for anyone to know his identity. Had she meant that it was dangerous for him? Was he currently on the cusp of impending torture? Was he being held here against his will? If that's the case, could he ever hope to be set free? Could he fight his way out? Should he? His rapid thoughts cut off and stopped short when suddenly, the door opened in a rush. And a man burst in, his expression uncertain, precariously hesitant as he took stock of the situation before him. Peter gasped at the sight of him, recognition immediately taking hold of him. The noise garnered that man's full attention as he gave him a soft, slightly crooked smile, though his eyes were still uneasy. "Hey, kid," Tony Stark greeted from the open doorway, holding his hands up in what appeared to be a reassuring manner. Apparently in an attempt to calm him down. "Tony?" he asked, completely shocked by the man's sudden appearance as it clashed against the narrative that he had constructed in his head. A woozy, dizzying sensation swept over him as the shift happened in his mind, his brain trying to work through the overwhelming confusion that he felt. Tony nodded, his slight smile grew into a grin at the sound of his own name tumbling past Peter's lips as he stepped meticulously closer. "That's right, kid. Look, I know that it must be scary and disorienting to wake up in a place that you don't recognize, but you are safe here. In fact, this is your bedroom." He looked around the small room with a fresh set of new eyes. It wasn't familiar to him at all. But it had to be his, because Tony said that it was. Right? His eyes shot back to the woman, who was staring back at him with somber and imploring eyes. I mean, if you say that this is a safe place, then who is she? He jerked his head, nodding once at the woman with his head as he indicated at her, his hands out of use as they still kept him attached to the wall. Tony frowned at the question, his eyes doing a quick sweep of the stranger woman sitting in the room before he shot Peter a chiding, almost reproachful, look. "Now don't go hurting her feelings, kid. This is your aunt. Don't you remember anything about her?" Gaping, he shifted his attention instantly so that he stared back at the woman, eyes going wide as it was revealed what exactly she was to him. "A aunt?" Pain pricked at his brain as he let out a sharp gasp. Then, a sudden memory assaulted him with such swiftness, it stole his breath away. It was the woman, his aunt, in front of him. He was young. No older than 7 years old. His aunt walked towards him, a slight, sad smile on her lips. Her eyes red-rimmed. When she came upon him, she knelt down in front of him, getting right down at his eye level as she gingerly took both of his hands into hers, cradling them gently in her touch. "Peter. You're going to be staying with your Uncle Ben and I from now on." His younger self started to cry, and shook his head fervently. "No. I don't want to. I want to live with my mom and dad." He saw his tears slip down his aunt's cheeks as she looked down at their clasped hands. "Your parents, Peter. They loved you so very much. But they are in a better place now, a place they can't come back from." He started to cry even harder. Not wanting to believe it. "I know it's hard," his aunt continued, her voice seeping with pure compassion as she did her best to comfort him, And I know that you're Uncle Ben and I can't ever replace your mom and dad, but we are going to love you just as much as they did. In fact, we already do. As though you were our own son. We love you, Peter. Jolting back from the memory, awareness came back to him. Just like the others, it had been so vivid as it played in his mind. It was then that he realized that tears had leaked out from his eyes and onto his cheeks, staining them with heat and redness as he was brought back to the present. Aunt May? He asked, his voice small and broken as he looked at the woman before him who had practically raised him. A relieved and shaky smile came to his Aunt May's tear-stained face. Why, you remember me? He nodded slowly, and let himself slide slowly down from his position on the wall, landing softly on the mattress. I remembered the day you told me that I was going to live with you and Uncle Ben. Lifting his hand, he brought it up and rubbed at his head, as though he were trying to command more memories to come back to him. When nothing further happened, he looked back up at the two adults who were silently willing him to say more with their eyes. And my name is Peter, isn't it? Aunt May grinned and nodded excessively, choosing to stand and went to sit next to him as she grabbed his hands in both of hers. Yes, Peter. That's your name. Thank God it's starting to come back to you. I was starting to worry that you wouldn't remember anything at all. She let go of his hands and pulled him into her arms, squeezing him tight against her. Peter followed willingly enough, even though he hardly knew much about the woman who was holding him. But it still felt nice to be cared for in this very confusing time. My parents are dead. Aren't they? He asked suddenly, his voice emotionless. Aunt May froze as his tactless remark registered with her. Yes. Her answer sounded simple, but held within it a voiceless, heavy weight. Peter swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in a jerking movement. How? Aunt May pressed him further against her, running her fingers through his hair once again. The touch was less of a comfort this time. It was a plain crash. Peter nodded, not really knowing what to feel. If anything, he felt terrible for not remembering anything about the two people who had created him. And Uncle Ben? Peter asked, his voice quiet. Where is he? Aunt May stiffened, and Peter knew that he had his answer. It's just us then? Peter asked, before she was forced to say anything further to him that brought up painful memories for her. Aunt May nodded against him, the movement causing her head to hit against his own. Tony chose that moment to clear his throat. Look, I may not be family. But, well, the two of you aren't alone. Peter peeked over at the man before him, somehow knowing that it was uncomfortable for Tony to reveal so much about his feelings. And it meant all the more to Peter knowing that Tony only did so because he cared about them. So, Peter smiled at Tony. A closed-mouthed one that let the man know that he understood, and felt the same way. At the look, Tony's entire body seemed to soften as he returned that same smile back at Peter. And at that moment, he knew with certainty that everything was going to be okay. Peter backed away from Aunt May's embrace then, looking down at his hands with a thoughtful expression. I know that this isn't going to be easy. With my memory on the fritz for a while. And I'm sorry for how I acted when I woke up, May. But I'm really going to be needing your help for a while. May nodded excessively, her hand went back up to brush back his hair. You can take all the time that you need, sweetheart. We'll be there for you every step of the way. She looked up at Tony, a sharp, yet imploring look in her gaze. Isn't that right, Mr. Stark? Tony stared at them, seeming to be at a loss for words, before he softened. Of course. I'll just have to speak to Happy and Pepper. Work a few things around. Peter beamed at him, finally feeling a semblance of balance and control in his life, and that look seemed to make it all worth it to Tony. Tony turned, cell phone in hand, going to the other room to make the intended calls. When Peter and Aunt May were alone, Peter turned towards her, questions in his eyes as he couldn't help but notice the blaring absence of the only other person that he remembered caring about. Swallowing against a forming lump in his throat, he asked, So, what did happen to Mary Jane? Aunt May frowned at him, her brows drawing inward with confounding perplexity. I'm not sure who you're talking about, Pete. Peter's eyebrows furrowed in confusion, thinking about the beautiful, red-headed girl who had taken care of him in his time of need. Had his mind just imagined her into existence? Was she even real? No. She had to be real. How else would he have managed on his own if not for her help? Needing answers, Peter pressed the issue, going on to say, she was the girl that found me in the alleyway. Oh. Aunt May's entire expression lightened with the briefest of flickers before it dimmed, knowing that her answer would disappoint him. I'm not sure. I didn't meet her. All I know is that Tony left to get you last night, and he came back with you. Then, in an attempt to lighten his mood, she went on to say, you were draped over his shoulder, so deeply asleep and blissfully unaware to the world. She poked him teasingly, but Peter didn't have the heart to even muster a smile. So, we didn't even get the chance to say goodbye. Fucking Spider-Man? Flynn Marco muttered, seething under his breath as he lay down on his cot in his jail cell next to some hotshot named Mac Gargan. Flint was royally pissed. And when he wasn't feeling pissed, he was downright terrified of the big man coming after them. After Spider-Man had swung off the night before, leaving them all webbed to surfaces inside of the van, they had waited for Tony Stark's men, or robots, to come collect them for the Avengers prison. Only, they hadn't shown up. Instead, the cops had been the ones to show up. There has to be some mistake. Flint had yelled as the police cuffed him. Tony Stark is supposed to be coming for us to take us to the Avengers prison. Sure. One of the cops said, his voice thick with bored sarcasm, as he pushed Flint's head down to get him in the back of the cruiser. And I've got a secret love child with the Hulk. Now he was a sitting duck in this jail cell, waiting for the big man to arrive to make him a dead duck. I hear you on that one, Mac Gargan commented from over on his own bed, even though any idiot would be able to tell that Marco's words weren't meant to be commented on from the fucking peanut gallery. Still, Gargan babbled on, proving his lack of tact, as well as his stupidity. That dumbass wall crawler is the reason I'm here in the first place. Flint grunted, turning on his cot so that his back was to his cellmate. No one cares, Gargan? Mac let out an annoyed sound, before continuing to talk anyways. You know. The vulture is here as this joint as well. Again with the not caring, Flint hissed, his fist clenching in his annoyance. The desire to punch something was suddenly strong within him, and if Gargan wasn't careful, it was bound to be his face that would become Flint's punching bag. Because if this was how he was going to spend his last hours, whiling the minutes in this fucking cell, he wanted it to be in relative peace. Without having to hear Mac Gargan's stupid, drolling voice. I have a theory that my old friend, Toombs, knows the webhead's identity. This piqued Flint's interest. What the fuck did he just say? That the vulture knew the spider freak's identity? Finally, Flint turned his head to look at his cellmate. You don't say? If he had the spider's identity, maybe he could trade his life for it when the big man came for him. Yeah. Toombs says he doesn't know it. Swears up and down. But, you never know. Flint scowled and turned back on his side. That was nothing but a bunch of hot steam. A hunch was no information, at all. I'm serious, you can tell that he... Boom. Both men cried out as an explosion blasted the wall out, both cowering and covering their heads. Fire and smoke blazed minimally at the newly constructed hole in the wall, and both men immediately started to cough as it got into their lungs. Hello, Marco. A menacing voice came from beyond the flames of the gaping hole. Flint uncovered his head, staring in horror at the masked man before him, smiling carnally in a sadistic manner. As the madman contemplated the fun of playing predator as he finally cornered his prey. His time was up. The big man. He was here. A.N. Gasp. WHO is the big man? All will be revealed in due time, my lovely readers. I would really appreciate it if you all left me a comment. It really encourages me to continue on with this story. Thanks to those of you who already leave me your lovely comments. Smile. Also, many of you may have already suspected that I am an avid Spider-Man comic book reader. As a result, you'll be seeing a ton of random Easter eggs dropped throughout this story. I would love it if you point them out if you manage to catch them. Thanks so much for reading. I love this community so much. Everyone is always so kind. Less than 3.